All right, so today we'll be discussing some of the concepts associated with plot. But as we discuss the concepts associated with plot, I'm very interested in you being able to write about plot. So you're going to write down some definitions, and I'm sure you're going to do your dutiful best to read what's on the board and copy it down. I care a lot less about that than I care about you being able to discuss the plot or conflict of a specific story, like Rikki Tikki Tavi or the dinner party or the open window, perhaps, that we read last week in that OAA workbook. So yes, copy down your notes, but we're going to quickly get into discussion on all of this. First of all, basic definition of a plot. A series of related events which compose a narrative, also known as a story. So let's look at some key aspects of this definition. Trying to think of an analogy here. Well, maybe one will come to me. Plot is made up of distinct and individual units, pieces. Bridget, what do we call them? Give you hints in the definition. Yeah, events. I emphasize this because words like this probably just flow right past you and you don't realize their importance. A plot is a series of events, and different events have different importance in the plot. One event we might call a climax. Another event we might call an initial incident. But you must recognize that a plot is developed through individual events. It should be recognizable. Something else I'd like to address is this word. Narrative is a word that is used to refer to a story. And I have a tendency to use the word narrative often, you know, from some of my college background. So if I say narrative, you should hear story. But it's a word that pops up in literature again and again when we talk about narrators, narration, narrative perspective. But narrative just means a story. So when we're talking about a narrative, the plot is a series of events that build it up. I've got some principles, some things to keep in mind. Just giving you a couple. The nature of events, definition of narrative. Plot events occur on a timeline. So one event happens before another. And when I talk about before, I don't mean in front of, I mean in relation of time. That means whenever you're thinking of time, you're thinking of plot. This happens before this. This is foreshadowing for this. Here we have a flashback going from here to here. All of those terms that have to do with time are plot terms. So when you think about time, you're thinking about plot. And an event has a placement in time. This last principle I emphasize more times than I care to think about. The most important consideration of plot is conflict. If there is no conflict, there is no plot. I've seen narratives that lack a climax. I've seen narratives that lack a resolution. I've seen narratives that lack an exposition. I've seen narratives that lack foreshadowing. They lack flashbacks. I've seen narratives that lack all sorts of different components, but every single one of them has a conflict. You don't have a story if you don't have a conflict. If you don't have a conflict, you might have a poem or an essay or some other kind of writing, but you don't have a story. And I like to think of this as sort of an engine, kind of a machine, and the thing that makes it go, the energy or the fuel, is the conflict. It drives everything. Yes, Jarrett. If I were just to write somebody just walking and nothing's happening, right, but that's not considered a story. That it's not considered a narrative. Now what it is just description. So some authors just write descriptive pieces where it's almost like painting, except you're using words. Right? Paintings don't always have stories, do they? Some paintings have stories. Some paintings convey stories. And you can do that with writing also. Sometimes you convey just an image in words. But we don't call it a narrative. We don't call it a story because it must have a conflict in order to be a story. Jasmine, give me one part of this diagram that you recall. We're going to label it. And where is that? Come here. Come on. Come on up. Jasmine, write the word climax, where you believe that is located. Yes, of course it's okay if you're wrong. Okay, thank you, Jasmine. Go ahead and put the pen down. Would anybody like to add a piece or correct a piece or, oh, wow, all the hands, nicely done. Max, why don't you start? Nope, you can drag it. That is correct. Thank you. Next, Karen. Thank you, though, Jasmine, for bringing the term to us. Okay, thank you, Karen. Next, Carson. Jarrett. Tell you what, erase. The hint for writing on smartboards without losing your place is not to look at what you're writing. When you write, you don't necessarily have to look, just write it. Don't think about it. That's fine. Jake. It's off a little bit. Just write. Yes. Interesting. Well, I like the mirroring. You know, his words are falling. He's writing falling action. It's kind of fun. Caitlin. Good. Thank you very much. Correct. There are your terms. Make sure they're arranged properly on your plot diagram. And let's talk some definitions once you've done that. We'll do this verbally, so make sure that you're writing down definitions as we discuss them. Brandon, can you give me the definition of exposition, please? Yes, that's true, but what happens in the beginning of the story? What are we given in the exposition? And? That's correct. The beginning of the story where the characters, setting, and other background information are given. The beginning of the story where characters, setting, and other background information are given. Exposition. The beginning of the story where characters, setting, and other background information are given. Andrea, do you recall the initial incident? What's the definition of that? Yeah, the first event of the conflict. The event that starts the conflict is the initial incident. The event that starts the conflict. Remember, I told you that this entire plot line is composed of individual events. This one is important because it is the first event of the conflict, the event that starts the conflict. Diana, how about rising action? Well, it's begun at the initial incident. What's happening to the conflict through the rising action? Okay, becoming, sometimes we say it's becoming more complicated, and that's why some people call this the complication. So that's another term that you can use for rising action, is complication. The rising action is the efforts to resolve the conflict. The efforts to resolve the conflict which result in a conflict becoming more complicated or intense. The efforts to solve the conflict which result in the conflict becoming more complicated or intense. Maxwell, definition of climax, please. That's right, the plot event that ends the conflict. Plot event that ends the conflict. Yes. Plot event that ends the conflict. Following action, Sophie? Well, sometimes it's really tricky to see the difference between following action and resolution, which I've at times not really appreciated dividing them. You're giving me a definition that's actually a little bit more like the resolution. So I'm going to say the following action is the immediate consequences of the climax. The immediate consequences of the climax. And then we'll use Sophie's definition for resolution, which are wrapping up any loose ends and ending the story. Yes, Karen? I'm sorry? The wrapping up of loose ends and the ending of the story. All right, let's do some lightning quiz here. Julie, what is the climax of Rikki Tikki Tavi? Uh-huh. Well, what would, it's not when he kills Nag, because that happens pretty much in the middle of the story, right? And the conflict's not over when he kills Nag, right? Because doesn't he still have to fight? Okay, so Julie, the conflict ends, the climax happens when he kills whom? Yeah, the wife, Nagina, or Nagina, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, down in the rat hole. That's the climax, because after that event, the conflict has ended. So that's, and it is probably, in my mind, the most intense moment of the story, because we're not quite sure at that moment whether or not Rikki Tikki Tavi is going to make it out alive. However, the more important definition is that's the plot event which ends that conflict. Let's see. How about initial incident? Bridget, what do you think the initial incident is when you first understand the conflict? I would say that's still that's part of the complication arising action. It's close to the initial incident, but I don't think I think there's something earlier. Very good. When he meets Nag and Nagina strikes at him, and he talks to the bird, and we get the conflict. The initial incident is such because we now understand what the conflict is. And tomorrow we'll talk about what type of conflict it is and how we can talk about it. Okay, that's good enough for today. You have a question, Caitlin?
Yeah. This is different
Oh yeah, Terabithia, sure.
the climax is kind of when she died, right?
Is it? Depends upon what your main conflict is. If your main conflict is a person versus nature conflict, then that's the climax because nature has won, correct? But is that your primary conflict in the story, person versus nature? I don't think so. I think it's more complex in that story. It might be a person versus person. What's the main character's name? Do you remember the boy's name? Yeah, Leslie, I think, but what's the boy's name? In Bridge to Terabithia. We're talking about a different story. His problems, his insecurities, I think, are the source of the conflict. And her death only makes things worse, so they further complicate. So that's still part of the complication of the conflict and not yet the climax, because I think it's all about him and his internal conflict. Does that make sense? Cool.